Whoa, 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 whoa. Testing 1, 2. How the hell can I not?
This is why everything makes so much more sense now. That bitch ass thing got unplugged. Where's my hoe ass brother? Walk through here kicking things around. Whatever. Don't matter. It don't matter. Now we watch. It's probably been like that all day too.
To do with energy and light and advantage by the law. So it's still not a scientific argument.
No doubt about it. And that's how our fun is created, is that we fix something that's broken.
So just a slave metaphor that transfers into, I guess, disabled people's rights, because disabled people.
Okay, I don't care. Apparently this guy made a video when I'm in it. I don't fucking know.
All right, so yeah, I can't make this video, but I need to put it out there. So I'm done. If I can unsubscribe from just like everybody who makes those, anybody who's, I guess, related to the organization in general, just because it shouldn't be an organization. I mean, it should be a philosophy. So I'm not gonna try to speak for the people who don't have a voice in or they're all friends. And yeah, so hopefully I don't know. But yeah, I don't want to put up with it. I'm just brought up in the conversation. So it's just really evil and obnoxious. I have the same, or I'm going to have the same outlook on, a group's aspect to my reality. So I'm not going to consider myself any part of a group. I'm just
Hmm. Welcome to the club. We're just big vibing. Another viewer. Just after the drama stopped unfolding, we were just watching a little bit of stuff that Dragon. Well, not really drama. We were trying to scope out drama, but I was hoping someone would be help me find out what the hell's going on. Apparently, someone said that like this Dragon dude's talking shit about my channel, and I'm like, oh shit, okay, intriguing. Love a little bit of drama, spicy, but can't find it, so I'm just kind of like, oh, when the tree falls in the forest, no one's around here, doesn't make a sound. No, well, I say no, it doesn't. Just as if he talks shit and I don't hear it, does it really matter? Pfft, not really. If a shit talker talks shit and no one hears it, does he make a sound? Good morning, y'all. Whatever time zone you're in, sure it's morning, seeing as I stayed up the whole night. It's either morning or it's like afternoon, maybe. I don't fucking know. Like, good afternoon. Good morning. What is the name of that dude's channel? He kept changing it. It was like Dragon something, like I am the Dragon, something edgy in the past. Now it's like, I don't know, like 420 Blaze, some bullshit. I don't fucking know. Let me like take a gander. 432HZ. Like
Disabled people
Like-
get left out.
Like all he does is talk shit. Let's see this video
It's
right
just religion. It's just covered up religion. It all has to do with the soul. It all has to do with the sun. It all has to do with energy and light. And yeah, it's really meaningless. Philosophy doesn't stand a chance in this world. It never had any prospects for making it in this world, or being some type of subsidiary in this world, being some type of industry. It's definitely not an industry. It has nothing to do with that sort of thing.
Nail it to a wall that somehow it's not real and it's not in the universe and it's not happening. So that's just too ridiculous. And once you concede that the conscious.
So it's too ridiculous, right? It's too ridiculous that we have a deterministic universe and there's no free will. That's all he's arguing. It doesn't go any further than that. So yeah, I really don't see why we have to.
What the fuck?
It's not real and it's nail it to a wall that somehow it's not real and it's not in the universe and it's not happening. So that's just too ridiculous. And once you concede that the conscious.
So it's too ridiculous, right? It's too ridiculous that we
see this 432 guy. He's just crazy motherfucker. He doesn't watch Gary's videos at all. Doesn't understand the context of what's going on. Because Gary understands determinism, is a determinist, understands everything's already set in motion, everything is bullshit. Doesn't mean that your choices don't have consequences, which is pain. Pain still matters, even if everything is determined, even if you're kind of a puppet on the string. If someone drove, someone drove a little chip into your brain that autopiloted your body and move your muscles, or like if you've seen The Last of Us, like the fungus just pilots the muscles, it doesn't actually, like, your brain's still intact. If that was going on, you could still feel the pain and understand what was going on. You'd be like, "Ow, this fucking sucks." And so, like, that's kind of what the deterministic universe is like, in a way, like a metaphor wise. It's like you're being piloted around. You're doing shit out of your control. You don't even realize it, but it still fucking sucks. It doesn't change the fact that experience fucking sucks and experience generates value. Like, Gary's not denying determinism. He's just saying that experience generates value. You little goober.
Have a deterministic universe and there's no free will. That's all he's arguing. It doesn't go any further than that. So yeah, I really don't see why we have to play these games week in and week out. Honestly, because we're only playing a game. I mean, we're only competing as sources of information for a collective group. And that's all it is. It's nothing more. I mean, you just replace soul with group, and then you replace group with politics, and then you replace politics with laws. But it's never going to get that far. So, yeah, your tax dollars are just feeding animal holocausts over and over again.
Experiences are happening. What's the argument? It's clearly obvious to any sentient being that there's a big difference between the bad ones and the good ones. Huge distinction.
So, on the topics of good and evil, this goes into basically the law giving and who gets to be advantaged by the law. So it's still not
really.
It's still not a scientific argument at all, because that's not how determinism plays its role in politics. Because it can't play its role in politics. Because yeah, we do have a religious system that we play under week in and week out.
And it's a value difference. No doubt.
So belief system is your values, and that's all that matters. It's your belief system. That's all that's all that matters. He's just drafting you into the army. He's just drafting you into the militia. Welcome to World War III. The martial law just hasn't come yet. So that's all it is. It's nothing more than that. It's just scare tactics, buffoonery. I don't know what to call it. It's just insanity. So yeah, maybe it's not good to feed off this system and just be a leech and a parasite and think you're going to get anywhere in life. Think that all of it really means anything. I mean, literally, say you have some purpose. Say his purpose is to make YouTube videos. and that's encouraging you all to make YouTube videos. I mean, I really don't see the point, but I digress. I mean, just at the deterministic value, see what it matters then.
The negative value, positive value. You could argue the positives, again, are made out of relief from a negative that where, as I pointed out, there's no carrots, there's just a whip. And if they stop whipping you, that's fun. No doubt about it. And that's how our fun is created, is that we fix something that's broken.
So just a slave metaphor that transfers into, I guess, disabled people's rights, because disabled people get left out of the box. The box is looking in on itself, and nobody wants to live those lives. And everybody's going to risk everything for
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. So you found my channel through his channel? It's fucking wild. Well, that's cool that people are finding my channel and comment sections of other people's videos.
all those lives. Well, the basic number of people, like it seems like the average amount of people are going to continue giving birth. So, yeah. I just don't see why you should have to give that any power, like, at all. So, yeah, sorry. I just don't agree with this.
Really made out of
Wow,
true
deep.
good. It's just the absence of a negative. And that's all it is. Too hot, too cold. Oh, just right. Just right is just not too hot and it's not too cold. That's what makes it just right. It really isn't that complicated. Anyway, moving on. Unpleasant, nasty torture. Yeah, so I guess I'm just explaining that, this isn't that hard to figure out. And I don't need you to believe. I mean, I've personally experienced it, so I don't need somebody to confirm it. I witnessed it, I saw it. I don't need somebody to tell me it doesn't exist. No, I did it. So don't bother trying to explain to me how my sensations don't have value. I'm experiencing them, I've tasted them, I know them, so fuck you, you're an idiot. You're insane, frankly. And that's probably what we should do, is just declare you insane. I mean, if somebody doesn't know the harm potential of creating torture in a feeling being, if you can't figure out that's bad, then probably should be, in protective custody somewhere. I mean, you get the idea of it without having to, as long as you can see, memories better when you're, okay. So we're just talking about the brain being a real function to the consciousness, and that, some conversation about the theater.
See,
And,
one critique that I do have a little bit about that statement that Gary made is that, like, him saying he experiences pain is bad, and that being the justification is a little suspect. And I like just because like religious people have like weird experiences too. They're like, oh, I saw God and Muhammad spoke to me and said toss that gay man off the roof, blah 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 blah, or whatever the fuck, So I don't know. Experience itself isn't exactly the best testimony, but universal experience, I do think, is a good testimony. Like a universal experience of a subjective being is objective, in my opinion. So, like pain, pleasure, those things are universally experienced as how they are, like a good thing if it's pleasure, or a bad thing, a aversive thing if it's pain. And so, therefore, if he would have said pain is objective because it's universally experienced, I'd have been like, Gucci. And he usually talks like that, but in this video, he was more like, I feel pains, therefore it's bad. And I have a little bit problematic with just the language used in this video right here, but you know. But for the most part, Gary being mint. I don't know why Dragon has problems with him.
Just trying to explain that it doesn't have to be what you think of as a theater. It just has to be a mechanical process that creates the screen in some form of representation, and the thing watching the screen and the building with the air in it. You don't need all that physical structure to create the same essence of it. Inside.
Is this dude okay? Out of curiosity, I'm not. I mean, you just kind of ended. These videos are always end so abrupt. I fucking hate that I don't have the autoplay thing turned off on here. I have it on my other account turned off.
Disabled people get left out of the box.
But why does he have like random ass money and like whatever the hell this is on? What is that? Hemp. This dude just has a bunch of random shit. Like, I don't know if this is like a dealer list or something, and like a bunch of cash just sitting on his counter, like just big chilling. What the fuck's going on in his counter? What is your fuck's given? Love schizos, man. Fucking A. I have a little.
What it's like to
I've been
practice
having
medicine.
a little wee bit of beef with Anton lately. Not really like actual beef, but just like disagreements philosophically. So I've just been kind of talking some shit about him being a subjectivist and being like, God damn subjectivist. If you're a subjectivist, really want to know how you're an antinatalist or how you have any perspective that you view as worth convincing others of, basically. Like if you're a subjectivist and you're like, oh yeah, to each their own, like, you know, I think murder's bad, and if you think murder's good, cool. Then I'm like, I guess, like, I think you're wrong, but I mean, at least you're consistent. But if you're like a subjectivist and you're like, no, I'm an antinatalist at the same time, I think people shouldn't have kids. It's wrong to have kids. And you're like a subjectivist, then I'm just fucking confused. Like, so that's why I'm like, I've a couple videos around, like 2, I think, just kind of talking about that subject more in depth. So if you want to hear that, go and listen to those. There's this one where I'm driving my car like earlier today, and I just go on a little rant about that. But I'm just gonna review Lawrence's newest video. I like Antinatalist MD. He is a deontologist, has some Christian vibes, some anti-abortion stuff, you know, similar to perpetual pleasurist in energy. So they would get along quite well, I think. Both people that I agree with that are a majority of things, I don't really have gripes with in any way. But philosophically speaking, I'm just like, we have disagreements, like, you know, like abortion. Like, I'm just like, if there was a, you know, that meme where it's like, if there's a child right in front of you, what would you do? In a pocket dimension, I'd just be like, bang. And then they could be like, you must nurture yourself and mature and become a better person. And then they would suffer and get cancer and die. So the moral story is like abortion, I'm cool with just being like, life's pain, adios, fetus, yeetus. And they're more like, abortion's murder, Daniel-san. And I'm just like, who gives a fuck? It's, we murder, by your definition, cells whenever we wash our hands and shit. And if you're perpetual pleasurist, you'd be like, yes, the demiurge is feeding off that energy. It's a tragedy in itself. And I'd be like, okay, if you want to believe that, but it's not really. I mean, I'm perhaps putting something into perpetual pleasures like Scott's mouth. Like he wouldn't actually perhaps say that just because like bacteria is not actually sentient, but he would say in a way perhaps it is like they have aversive responses to things and like they respond to their environments, or perhaps like just the nature of like destruction is like feeding the demiurge or whatever. So I don't know. I'm getting off topic. More stories. Let's just get into the video.
That hasn't seen the first one, I will do a tiny bit of
Cash
background. So
user bomb.
basically, there is a YouTube channel run by a guy who is a doctor, a healthcare professional, and an antinatalist. And his channel is called Antinatalist MD. And he has done, I think technically there's 21 videos, but a series of 20 videos where he talks about a variety of topics, but from the perspective of someone who's a healthcare professional and an antinatalist. So there's 20 episodes, but there's an additional video which is I haven't actually watched it, but by the sounds of the title, it's him having a conversation with someone who's not an antinatalist. So I've already done a stream, which was part 1 episode, which we went through episodes 1 to 10, and I wanted to get in a live stream doing 11 to 20. So that is this live stream. So Jay's in the chat saying that they love the streams. Well, thank you. I actually quite enjoy doing them because what I actually do now, well, not with this specific one because this one's themed, it's, you know, Antinatalist MD, but with the reaction streams, now what I do is if I come across a video that I think would be interesting to watch and I don't, because the perfect situation obviously would be that, you know, they never best way to go about things. So no one wants to be in and out of healthcare. Like it's not a nice part of your life in general, right? But 2, like you may have, so yeah, hence, you know, it's already starting to get a bit cooler in the UK now, so hence why I'm doing this at this time.
Oh, this video is
episode 11. Hey JB as well. So it's, well, you can see that practicing medicine as an antinatalist. So let's see what he's got to say about that. Obviously, as always, let me know if there are any issues with audio. And Rune is in the chat as well. Hello from Sweden. Was it Dave was in the chat yesterday?
I've seen that video. It's basically, if you're Antinatalist MD's channel is amazing, by the way. Highly recommend checking out all of his videos, if not just to support his channel.
Oh, my bad. My mic's all the way up here. Yeah, I highly recommend checking out Antinatalist MD's channel, but I'm going to skip to the more interesting videos. The one that I was just on the screen there is mainly just talking about, like, you know, like recommending like birth control and stuff like that, and like talking about like abortions, and like not only he doesn't really talk about abortions much, but because he's anti-abortion, but mentioning abortion, so that, and like procreative like methods, like being like safe with your partner and all that jazz. But it's really not anything that's like too interesting in my opinion, so I'm just gonna kind of, you know, skip that one for now. But let's go and see what this is.
Is the burden of being aware of all of the sort of wrongs and suffering and injustices in the world and how it weighs on you mentally, I would assume.
Well, many of the antinatalist conclusions seem brutal. They are emotionally heavy, dark, and difficult to process. For example, take the following common conclusions of the philosophy. Creating sentient beings causes suffering where none was there before. Having children is therefore immoral, so everyone who has had children has done a great wrong, whether they realize it or not. Parents are ultimately responsible for the death of their offspring, since had the children not been brought into existence, they would not have had to endure their eventual inevitable death. If everyone abstained from committing the immorality of procreation, humans would go extinct. Even though ethical antinatalism is based on solid principles like prevention of suffering and respect for autonomy and consent, the truth is, if you're not ready to handle the logical conclusions of antinatalism, they can be emotionally destabilizing. If you take anti-nihilism seriously, it could put into question your whole worldview.
Yeah, actually in the stream yesterday of the reacting videos, there was one video that we watched where it was by the Graphene Rule, and I think it was called The Problem of Antinatalism or something like that, or Problem with I can't remember. But in that he talks about this trade-off that some people have to make between recognizing the ethical weight of the antinatalist argument and embracing that, or your mental well-being, like your life experience. Now, luckily for many people, they don't have to make that trade-off because they can intellectually hold a position in their head, but not have it like really have any. There's no kickback from that in their emotional lives. But for some people, they find it very hard to separate those two things out. And like honestly, I really feel for those people. And this doesn't just go for this issue. There's many ethical issues where this will be the case, where people are so emotionally invested and impacted by an issue, which is completely understandable. A few times in the chat as well, which is completely understandable, and something that you know the people who don't have that issue should empathize with, because imagine becoming aware of a great injustice in the world, or the fact that there are so many individuals suffering in a way that you did not understand before, and it's a very significant way, and you can't get your mind off it. You know, there are people like that. For example, I was listening to a podcast the other day by George Martin, Carnism Debunked, with the lady, I forget her name now, but the lady who runs Bite Size Vegan, and she was saying that she's autistic, and I'm pretty sure she was saying this is relating to her autism, that she was saying that as a result of her autism, she can't switch off the thing in her head that makes her essentially experience secondhand suffering from all the suffering that's going on around her. So she's specifically, you know, thinking about the things that happen to animals in, you know, in animal agriculture and, you know, clothing industry and animal experiments and stuff. And she was just saying, like, some people can just hold that intellectual belief, that rejection of animal exploitation, and you know, they can hold that as an intellectual thing, but not have it emotionally drain them every day. And she was saying that she, you know, as a result of her autism, she just can't do that. Like her like, however you would call it, like her empathy is just constantly pumping. Yeah, honestly, like I feel for people like that, because that it must be a very difficult way to live.
No,
I mean, it can
it's
have its advantages.
really
in terms of
true.
those
I
people being
had a
able-
friend that had autism, and they were extraordinarily empathetic, but made me become more empathetic. And unfortunately, having empathy in this world is not very beneficial for the self. It's only beneficial for those around you. And well, she took her own life. So, moral of the story is, empathy is like a slow burning poison. It just seeps into you and kills you. So, autistic people have it hard. I'm lucky, I'm pretty much a psychopath.
Dedicated people, because they have this constant, you know, thing pounding away at them in their head. But it also just must be really difficult to live like that. Anyway, Hobo's also back in the chat. Cool. Okay, let's listen to the rest of this one.
Depending on what it was founded on to begin with. I've had very emotional conversations on anti-nihilism, and I wanted to make space for the toll this topic can take on people, both anti-nihilists and non-anti-nihilists. As anti-nihilists, not only do we have to deal with the conclusions I just mentioned, but we also have to deal with the fact that most people in the world do not agree with us. To be clear, none of this makes the philosophy any less true, but it does mean that we carry a sort of burden. I think of this burden a bit like I think about facing my own mortality. It's there, it's undeniable, but with time you get used to it. And eventually it may even become an odd source of comfort.
So I don't know specifically what he means there by an odd source of comfort, but what I could get from that is
Promortalism, baby.
One way that it can be an odd source of comfort is that it a realization, an ethical realization like antinatalism or veganism or some other one, it can engage you in a subject that you care about, which you haven't before. So you become more active as a person in terms of you actually care about things, and you become more intentional with your actions, and you become more ethically aware on other issues as well. But it can also engage you with a community, like a new community. You can form strong friendships and bonds with other people, new people that you wouldn't have before, because you have this shared understanding of the world. Now, not to liken it in because, well, I guess I am likening it, but I think there's a similar thing with religion. So, in the past, when the world, maybe it's less significant now because we have the internet, but with religion in the past, it served as a bonding mechanism for people, right? It still serves as a bonding mechanism for now, but the specific example that I'm going to give, it's still relevant today, but it's not as relevant. So in the past, it would take many months, even years, to travel great distances. Whereas now, you can travel to the other side of the world in a day. But in the past, it was a great journey, right? But religion, if you take the example of Christianity, spread across the world, someone could leave one part of the world, go to a completely another part of the world, whole different culture, all this sort of stuff, like completely foreign and alien to you. But you meet someone in a market or a town square or whatever, and they are also Christian. You instantly know certain things about that person and have a shared thing, an experience that you can, an understanding of the world that you can use to relate with each other. And the same thing is with antinatalism or veganism now. Like if you, for example, I don't know, let's say you go to, let's say you're, I don't know, what is a good example? I mean, this is like a very, like, I don't actually know if this would actually happen to people, but just to illustrate an example, you go on holiday somewhere and, you in a bar or something, you're talking to a few people and you find out that one of them is vegan or is antinatalist. You would instantly be able to command more rapport with that person and have more of a connection with that person, and probably be much more interested in spending time and getting to know that person than the other people, because you have this sort of more unique connection with them, right? So I can understand. So if that is one of the things he means by like an odd source of comfort, then I can agree with that.
Non-antinatalists may be battling with the burden of facing mortality, and antinatalism simply reminds them of this. I once heard someone say, when arguing against antinatalism, I have no interest in believing in something so horrible when I can believe in something wonderful. And later saying, I'll take suffering if it means humans have a future. I understand where they're coming from. It's hard to come to terms with the fact that humans will not be around forever. And if your source of hope is in humans continuing to exist indefinitely, it's hard to step back and think about the cost entailed in delaying the unavoidable extinction of humanity, the suffering of billions of people that ultimately will not prevent the inevitable. Because it is in the presumably far future, it seems too abstract. But the truth is, it will be just as real as the suffering of currently existing people if we decide to contribute to this cycle. This person's response made me think about whether the potential gloominess that antinatalism can cause is an effective argument against it. After all, some people might not be able to handle the existential crisis the philosophy might cause.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's about to say what he's about to say, but in terms of my reaction to that question, I don't think it would say anything against like the philosophy or the arguments or like the truth of it. But it can definitely be a consideration in terms of how people are going to be impacted by coming to this understanding. So if we understand that many people are, when it comes to their experience of the world, it coming to this realization can cause them to become more sensitive or have more sort of mental anguish. It may not be a significant amount more, but it would just maybe be some. If we have that understanding, then those in the community that have the initiative can put things together, put frameworks together that can support those people. So, one example which I've been talking about recently is meetups. Being able to physically meet or, virtually meet with people who, share a similar outlook with you on the world. That is a comforting thing for people, and it can help people if they're going through a lot mentally. So, yeah, recognizing issues like that, I think, are good. One, because you come to a closer understanding of the truth, but also it means that you understand an issue and you can implement a solution or like alleviate it in some way.
If the thought of anti-nihilism increases suffering for that person sufficiently, maybe this is a reason not to expose this person to the philosophy. However, this only makes sense if the person does not procreate. In other words, one can believe the anti-nihilist position to be wrong in order to feel better about life, but ethically it only is acceptable if in the end one doesn't in turn cause more suffering by reproducing. Despite the potential gloominess of the philosophy, anti-nihilists can still enjoy the pleasant things in life. After all, the goal of minimizing suffering includes minimizing our own suffering. And I do think it's possible to both hold anti-nihilism to be an ethical way of making decisions, while at the same time enjoy things even if they are immersed in a pro-nihilist world. Nihilism doesn't seem pragmatically useful either. Even if one believes in a globally meaningless universe, there is still meaning locally because joy matters to the individual, just like suffering matters to the individual.
Yeah, it's like obviously it would have been better if, you know, you were never here, but like now you are. Make the best of it you can, you know. Like no, I've literally never heard, and I'm obviously he's not saying this, but I'm just saying in general. Like I've never heard an antinatalist say that we should actively like just wallow in badness. You know, like we should obviously all try and have as good a life as possible.
For the already existing person, a few moments of joy are still of value. Another thing to realize when faced with the gloominess of the philosophy is that its realism has a lot of merit. Anti-nihilists know the end is inevitable, whether talking about our personal death or the eventual extinction of humans. So instead of pretending death and suffering don't exist or can't be prevented in the future, we decide to actually take the ethical route and not perpetuate suffering to future generations. That is an amazing accomplishment to be proud of, even if we just do it at a personal level. And just maybe, knowing this can bring comfort, even if everything else around us goes badly. Thanks for listening.
So that was episode 12. Oh, nice. So episode 13 will be an interesting one. So, sorry, I opened that in a new window rather than a new tab. Everything's going wrong. Yeah, so 13 will be an interesting one. So it's about Anyara. Well, I might be saying that wrong. Anyara, which, as you can see here, is a film. So I'm pretty sure he will.
Anyara. That's a good anime film.
But yeah, basically, Anyara is a film that someone could draw some antinatalist themes from, but it's also just a very interesting film. It immerses you in this situation that, well, let's just listen to what he says, because I actually don't want to say too much. If he doesn't say it, then I will add the bit. I'll try to remember to add the bit that I was just about to say on the end if he doesn't say it. But if you enjoy this video, there's also Voidcast, which is a vegan antinatalist podcast.
Wish you would put like timestamps for what the episodes' names were
in London,
in the video.
In Germany, I forget which city now. And they did an episode on Anyara as well. So if you enjoy this,
but then again, I don't put timestamps in my videos. So what am I? I'm just being like timestamps, and I'm like, I don't do me.
I'll try to remember to link in the description.
Every once in a while, you come across a movie that causes you to ponder for a long time after watching it. I watched the movie Anyara recently, which is based on a famous Swedish poem of the same name, and it's worth unpacking some of the themes it brings up, such as sense of purpose, existential crisis, procreation in a hopeless world, and the limits of optimism, to name a few. I will be talking about the whole movie, and I would give a spoiler alert, but really, even after hearing the spoilers, the movie is still worth watching. The basic plot goes like this. Earth's environment is too chaotic and dangerous for humans to continue living in it, so people are routinely transported to a Mars colony to continue life there. Anyara is the name of a massive spaceship that ferries a couple thousand people at a time. The trip is supposed to take 3 weeks, but the pilots are
Anyara?
I was thinking of Akira.
Anyara's an anime. Anyara's a fucking this is Anyara's a great
This
movie.
turns out to mean
I own
the
that
ship is unable to get back on course.
What am I
and
thinking?
The ship drifts out into deep space without a clear way to get back. Anyara is basically a self-sustaining small city, and they figure out a way to continue making food, apparently having enough energy to power all the ship's
It's like a
inner
sex
workings.
cult and shit. It's great.
The main character, MR, operates an artificial intelligence called Mima on the ship that reads people's memories and allows them to re-experience pleasant memories of the Earth as it used to be, in a sort of very realistic virtual reality. As time goes on, more and more people are interested in this experience as a form of escapism from their plight. But eventually, Mima is overwhelmed with people's despair and emotional burdens and self-destructs. It's quite an interesting twist to have AI essentially kill itself due to humanity's mental burdens and it might be a commentary on how simulation technology, and perhaps technology in general, has its limits in saving humanity from itself. Throughout the journey, the captain attempts to publicly keep a stoic face about the situation and outright lies about the ship's chances to get back, giving passengers false hope. This character seems to represent an authority figure that will do whatever it takes to maintain order and avoid chaos from the reality of hopelessness. It seems that telling people there is still hope is also his own way to avoid thinking about the inevitable, even though intellectually he knows the truth. As the years go by, MR forms a romantic relationship with one of the pilots named Isabel. They somehow find themselves being part of a ritual in a cult that worships and prays to the now dead Mima. As a result of her actions at one of these gatherings, Isabel becomes pregnant. Earlier in the movie, Isabel's character is described as fatalistic, and facing the potential of giving birth to a child under these conditions doesn't seem to help. There is one scene where she is seen deeply regretting being pregnant, saying, "There are no possibilities here. I'll give birth to a prisoner. I'll deliver someone to eternal night." Although not explicitly anti-natalistic, the movie at least encourages one to think of the ethics of bringing more humans into this situation.
I bet you so that misses so many people who watch this movie by. I think I bet so many people just procreation is just so normalized, obviously, that most people wouldn't even think they would see what the character is saying, but they would in no way relate that to their own lives and make them question their own actions. I would bet.
Throughout much of the movie, MR represents the tenacious optimist. She is often in a good mood and seems to bounce back even after the many episodes of bad news, although she does suffer from occasional panic attacks, which she deals with in private. After Isabel's dark reflections on her bringing a child, MR quickly responds saying, "I promise, it's going to be fine."
Oh, it's
And for a
not going
while,
to be
it
fine,
seems
Judizzle.
things are okay. They raise a child together, and Isabel hides her persistent fatalism. But eventually, Isabel tragically kills herself and the child. And MR
I don't know if
doesn't
that's
seem to ever
tragic.
recover from this.
That's a
The movie seems to
bold-
draw a
no,
line
I'm
for the
kidding.
limits of optimism and people's different
But I'm
psychological
pro-mortalist,
breaking
so it's
points.
not tragic.
Another interesting character was the ship's astronomer. Due to her background knowledge,
She's a
she is
real
one of the
G.
few people who knows from the beginning there is no realistic way for the ship to get back, despite whatever the captain says. In an attempt to drown out her realizations, she drinks alcohol heavily most of the day. At one point, she does discover a mysterious object is heading for the ship. At first, it is thought this could be a rescue fuel rod, but eventually it turns out not to be.
Rip.
Again, she is the first to arrive at this correct conclusion, and she turns back to alcohol. As she confronts the
As I
captain
do.
about his denial and hypocrisy surrounding the false hope he gives passengers, the captain gets fed up with her and shoots her dead. With impunity, I may add, since no one really questions his authority. The astronomer seems to represent the realist who knows too much and can't keep quiet, and who eventually collides with an authority figure who is ever more desperate to maintain order and some semblance of hope. The last survivors are seen chanting in a dark room 24 years into the journey. Their faces cachectic, almost zombie-like, essentially awaiting death. In a strangely haunting way, the last frame of the movie shows the ship 5.9 million years afterwards, traversing by an Earth-like planet in the Lyra constellation. The music is pretty impactful, leaving you thinking, sitting still.
Just checking how long there is left because I'm just thinking I don't know if he's going to make the point. So he may make the point, but let me just make it now because it is getting towards the end and now he's talking about music, so I'm not sure he will. So one there are many interesting things that this movie will make someone who is interested in think about this stuff.
Yeah.
There are many things, but there are two key things that either came to my mind or I've been made aware of. So the first point is it obviously it makes you it brings to the forefront the question of whether it's ethical to put people in certain positions or any position, as an anti-natalist would see it. But so obviously he's explained the context. You have a ship,
Yellow.
it's going,
Got
so
self-killed.
it's not coming back. The population on the ship has some capacity to sustain themselves, and so I have seen the film, but I actually can't remember if they just slowly sort of give up and that causes the systems to fail because people engage less, or if they could have actively continued keeping things up. But either way, over time, systems start to fail, people disengage, and eventually that all leads to everyone, dying and stuff.
Hooray.
But yeah, so it leads people to question, like, if you're in a situation of essentially like hopelessness and meaninglessness,
It's really not about
is
that,
it okay to
Anton.
bring someone into that situation?
It's literally, I mean, it's literally just a metaphor of a confined bubble. A bubble, okay? A select few people in a self-sustaining vessel. It's exactly like Earth, basically. It has a limited amount of time before it eventually ends, before its biosphere collapses. It can completely sustain itself until then. It has food, sex, drugs, every single amenity that of modern times, plus more. So it's better than Earth. It's not a hopeless situation. This is Earth times 1,000. This is just putting Earth into perspective, my G. This is just saying you are a thing hurtling through space in the darkness, the void, and it's just shrinking the thousands of miles to thousands of people in this thousands of acres. So it's really not about like a hopeless situation. No, life is a hopeless situation. It's about life itself, my dude. Aniara is about the planet being shrunk down to a size of a vessel.
Which is an interesting one because, and this brings us on to the second observation, which I did not make. So I got this observation from the Voidcast episode, which I mentioned before. So in that episode, the two hosts talk about how many people might not pick up on it, but this story is really an allegory. I think it's the correct term is allegory for our current situation. So if you think about it, those people on the ship, they are a population that is contained within an object that is just drifting through space aimlessly. It's not particularly going in any direction. It's just aimlessly drifting through space. And we view that as, oh, their lives are now meaningless. This is all going to come to an end. What is the point?
Yes, saying what I was about to say.
But if you think about it, what situation are we in now? We're a population, a bigger population of like 8 billion, but we're a population rather than we're on an object that is drifting through space, and eventually all of it will come to an end. So
I haven't watched this. I swear. I swear. That's where we basically just repeat ourselves.
From ourselves,
but
so we're observing it externally rather than observing ourselves, which makes it easier for people. And hey, Hubborn's in the chat. But also everything's condensed. So in the situation we're currently in now, the numbers are bigger, the time frames are bigger, all of this sort of stuff. In that circumstance, it's external to us, so we can observe it as thinking it's something we're not in. Everything's on a shorter time frame with a smaller amount of people. And so it's easy for us to say, oh, that situation seems hopeless. Like, yeah, I wouldn't want to be in that situation. And like, would I bring a kid into that situation? It seems kind of cruel. Well, the thing is like, we are in that situation. It's just people have status quo bias, basically. The status quo is the situation we're in now. And so people become attached to that and essentially take it for granted. It's like the water you swim in. And so they don't necessarily recognize the same ethical sort of ethically relevant parts of the situation they're in than if they were observing it as an external third party, as you do in the film. I don't know if I explained that well, but you get what I mean. Yeah, so Hubborn's in the chat. Robert has just joined the chat as well from New York. Hey, Robert. And Nadia says, there's no way the ship lasts 5.9 million years or that they'd still be human in so long. Chimps were one with humans 5.9 million years ago. No. So in the film, when it jumps to, so the film kind of has chapters, so it's like day one, then it skips to like, a couple of weeks later or whatever, then it skips to a couple of years later or months or whatever, it has like time relevant chapters, and the last chapter is like 5.9 million years in the future. Like everyone's dead, so there's no evolution happening, like everyone has died. Yeah, and the ship and the ship is just drifting through space aimlessly, with no life on it. Cool. Let's continue.
Well into the closing credits. Even though I really liked it, I have to say this is one of the most disturbing movies I've seen. Amongst all the different themes it explores, I think it most saliently exposes just how much hope and purpose, whether real or not, are important in finding energy to continue daily life. At the same time, it points out how reality eventually prevails. I think one of the reasons why the movie is disturbing is because one could interpret the ship as representing Earth, a self-contained vessel with limited resources flying through space without a specific destination.
Sorry, there's just in the chat. So Nadia is in East Harlem, which that's in New York, right? Is it, or am I getting that wrong? I have been to New York, but it was a while ago, and I kind of forget. So you guys could organize a New York meetup. That would be cool to see. We do them in London. You guys could organize like a it's Manhattan. Cool.
There is some comfort in the equalizing solidarity this could bring to encourage us to be more compassionate to ourselves and others. If only we realized it. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, it is an interesting film. So I would recommend.
It's pretty good. I've
watch
seen it like 2 or 3
And,
times.
If you
It's
find the
good.
idea of the film interesting, watch it, and then also go watch the Voidcast episode as well.
Follow
So episode 14 is environmentalism and antinatalism.
up question.
Now we get into the saucy material where I'm like, because they're gonna be like, yes, man, nature's beautiful. Well, here's 2 things. He's either gonna be like environmentalism. He's gonna be like, I forget. I haven't seen this in a while. He's either gonna be like, you can protect the environment by going and humans are very destructive to the ecosystem, or he's gonna be like the truth, which is nature's brutal, everything suffers, a pointless drive of evolution means no end. And, basically just explain how, like, things just suffer for no fucking reason. And we're just like, oh, wow, isn't this beautiful? Ooh, look at the tiger stripes. So, one of the two. But either I'm going to have massive gripes of this video, but be sympathetic to human nature, or I'm going to be like E and, have some fun time where I'm just like, nice, some good shit. Let's find out.
Why would we want to protect the environment?
We
For the
wouldn't.
moment, let's focus on humans and their predicament. Let's assume the sole.
Okay, sorry. The actually, I don't think that started from the start. The volume is unusually quiet on this one. So what I'm going to do is play it, and you guys can put your volume up, and I'm going to not talk as much or move the microphone away so my voice isn't as loud, so I don't deafen you.
With all the focus on climate change and environmental destruction lately, I've been thinking about viewing environmentalism through an anti-natalist perspective. A simple dictionary definition
Anton
of environmentalism
gives he's sympathetic to negative utilitarianism and suffering-focused ethics, but he gives off mad deontological / he's a subjectivist. So he gives off, because he's a subjectivist. I mean, I don't think he has this crazy strong principles based off of like a backbone of like pain or whatever. It's just kind of like, oh, I feel this, and so therefore. So I have a feeling he's going to be like sympathetic to the environment and like hands-off approach to nature. So I'm curious what he has to say.
is an ideology that aims to protect the environment. A natural, though often overlooked, follow-up question is, why would we want to protect the environment?
Please
For the
don't.
moment, let's focus on humans and their predicament. Let's assume the sole purpose of protecting the environment is to spare humans of the perils of drastic climate-driven disruptions in their lives. If we assume that humans are the single largest source of destruction of natural habitats and contribution to unwanted climate change,
Oh,
and
we're
if
going
having
that
more humans
destruction.
means getting more destruction,
I hate
then
this
every
bullshit.
environmentalist's goal should be to help ethically reduce the global population.
So that's what Vehement is all about. That's the voluntary human extinction movement. They're an environmentalist movement.
It's puzzling to me why something so obvious is so taboo. If your house is flooding because you left a faucet running over a faulty sink, the most logical first step to prevent worsening flooding is to shut off the valve. It's quite frustrating that this is so hard for people to hear. If people voluntarily opted to not procreate, we would spare billions of future people the suffering that will come with a harder way of life in a chaotic environment, and we would reduce the consequences existing people would have to deal with. I once voiced a version of this obvious fact in a public forum, and in addition to the idea being rejected, there were proposals suggesting that we can all just use fewer resources, implying that therefore the reproduction rate wouldn't have to be addressed. First, there is obviously a mathematical limit to this.
Yeah, I also, I mean, maybe he's going to say this, but I don't see that happening. So I think there are some instances where people will voluntarily use less resources, but the overall trend is that humanity is using more resources just because we've got so many more people coming out of poverty now in developing nations. So even if people like, for example, I might be misled, but the sort of common accepted wisdom is that Americans use the most. They're the most resource intensive population per capita. I might be wrong on that. There might be some European countries that per capita use more resources, but
Nah, it's
if we just
probably
take Westerners
America.
as an example, right? Like Westerners could voluntarily reduce the amount of resources that they use, which generally I don't think is going to happen. They might slightly, but significantly, I'm not hopeful. But the thing is that the Western lifestyle has been set as a standard. So many, if not all, developing nations are trying to achieve that. So the resource consumption is only going to go up. The only way I can see resource consumption going down significantly, and I may be wrong on this, but there are two ways: either massive authoritarianism from governments, which is not a good thing.
Says
or
who?
we become more efficient.
Only
So
you.
we can,
You're not giving me
we
a
can
reason,
achieve the
Anton.
same standard of living and
I want my
and
philosopher
do all the
king.
things and consume all the things we want, but it just requires less input because the technology or whatever has become more efficient, or we produce less waste. There's less coming because if you take food, for example, like an insane percentage, I think it's something like 30-40% of food that is produced is wasted. Now I might have got that statistic a bit wrong, but there's a significant amount is wasted. So we can tighten that up, stuff like that. But yeah, overall the trend is that we're using more resources. And Nadia is saying that Meetup, which I think you're talking about the app, right, doesn't list any antinatalism groups in NYC. I see some child-free groups, mostly for women. Yeah, so Nadia, one thing that I'm hoping to do is try and put something together that's going to help people organize meetups. I don't exactly know what that's going to look like yet, but I've got some ideas that I'm playing around with. So hopefully soon there will be something that is put together where then people who want to organize a meetup can just use that as a blueprint to create some sort of meetup event that they can then advertise. But yeah, if there's any movement on that, I will update people.
Marco,
via video.
chill.
So now you're saying Qatar, Luxembourg, and the UAE are ahead of the US in resource usage. Yeah, okay, yeah. So there are a few countries that are using more. And Almari, hey, Almari's in the chat as well, saying, what about Jevons paradox? Getting more efficient fixes nothing. I am not sure what Jevons paradox is, so if you could explain that in the chat, but I'm guessing maybe what you mean is that Jevons paradox is that if we become more efficient at producing things, it means that rather than maintaining the standard of living and using less resources, we actually increase the standard of living, so we end up using the same amount of resources as we did before. Is that what Jevons paradox is?
Second, we have to acknowledge that this leads to drastic reductions in quality, or at least style of life, whether we
Marco,
like it or
fuck
not.
off.
It is physically unsustainable for more than 7 billion people to live like the industrialized middle and upper classes live currently.
Marco.
If we are to keep some sense of ethical avoidance of
Stop
disparity,
scratching the couch.
this leads to
You
the
know you're not allowed
need
to do
either
that.
to lower everyone's standards or reduce the population
He's
size
like, yeah, but you're not
by
giving me
avoiding further
attention, so I'm
procreation.
breaking the rules.
I'm not against changing our standards. That will unavoidably happen for the vast majority of people regardless. But something has to give. And reducing the population size obviously makes more sense, although population reduction and limiting wastefulness of resources are certainly not mutually exclusive. Having said all this, as an anti-natalist, it is clear to me that even if climate change were not a problem, avoiding procreation is the most ethical choice in order to reduce suffering. In fact, I would like to avoid anti-natalism being limited to an environmental argument. Anti-natalism makes sense because of the inherent characteristics of sentient existence and suffering, regardless of how the climate may or may not change. But if one is to claim environmentalist ideals, one should strongly consider leaning toward anti-natalism if the goal of environmentalism is to reduce suffering.
Fair
Humans
enough.
or of other sentient creatures. And speaking of other sentient creatures, claiming environmentalism while ignoring the suffering of animals effectively makes environmentalism meaningless. it romanticizes evolution by natural selection. That is, it romanticizes a process that depends on death and destruction in order to perpetuate death and destruction further. Nature can be awe-inspiring and subjectively beautiful, for sure, but that is only part of the picture. The gazelle still experiences pain when it is eaten alive, and the cheetah still suffers as it starves when there's drought. We can protect those animals' natural habitat all we want, but their suffering still exists. I don't claim to have any easy answers to this problem, but to hold nature up as the ideal to aspire to is delusional if one cares about the suffering of sentient creatures. Someone listening to this might interpret.
Amara's just put in the chat. So Jevons paradox occurs when technological progress or government policy increases efficiency with resource use, reducing the amount of resources necessary for anyone to use. But the falling cost of use induces increase in demand enough that resource use is increased rather than reduced. Right. Okay. So the paradox kind of hinges on the change in prices. But yeah, I think I got somewhat close to it. But yeah. No, to be fair, yeah, that also could happen. So maybe we're just generally fucked.
That I would
Oh,
want
we're
the
100%
extinction
generally
of all
fucked, Anton.
sentient beings. But
Always
that is not
have
quite
been.
right. Although carrying out anti-nihilism would likely result in extinction, strictly speaking, that is not the goal. The goal is to end suffering, especially if the suffering is inflicted without consent. If somehow there were a way for beings to live without suffering, and it was their wish to keep living forever, that would be just fine from an anti-nihilist perspective. But of course, such a feat is likely impossible in our physical universe. So this means extinction is the next logical conclusion. In the end, whether someone finds reasons in environmentalism or religion or philosophy or whatever else to not procreate, the reasons may not matter as much, as long as the result is the ethical reduction of suffering. Thanks for listening.
Cool. Okay. Gonna bring my microphone back now. Yeah, there's a big there's one sort of big
Popular.
there's one oh, this one's actually got a video rather than a still image. Yeah, one sort of point of contact between what do you call it, environmentalism and antinatalism, which is the most common one that I hear people talk about, is with antinatalism, obviously, you know, the view is that coming into existence, a sentient being coming into existence is a harm for that being. And in the wild, a lot of individuals are coming into existence. And so there's a question as to whether antinatalists should be environmentalists or not, because
There we go, Anton. Covering the good shit.
So to give one example of where, like, that sort of, you know, where the ethical context really hits home is rewilding. So if you know, take, like, so humans have deforested a lot of areas, you know, which people can have qualms with that in and of itself. But given the fact, like, it's been done now, so now you have a question of, should we rewild? Which, assuming that rewilding increases the amount of sentient beings that are going to be brought into existence on that land, many antinatalists would say, actually, no, we shouldn't. Whereas many environmentalists would say, yes, we definitely should. So that is one specific sort of conflict there. Heartborn is saying that he read or heard a lot of vegans advocating for continuing procreation. They say we must solve the wildlife suffering problem.
Hey.
In one generation, and we must.
That was really gay, Spirit Oyster.
To procreate. It's an interesting one. So it's
no, I'm just kidding.
Well, rather than
but
delve
don't say
into
hey
the
3
in
times
full,
in a row if you don't want someone
the only
to
thing I would say
respond
is,
like
like,
that.
Out of all the arguments I've heard for procreation, that sort of argument is the one that comes close to being a good argument, although I'm not, like, convinced by it. But if you want to watch more on that, watch my video, The Antinatalist Dilemma. I did a video specifically on that.
1 second, I'm gonna go put my cat down.
Yeah. I think there's a delay on the stream. So Hardborn's just said that he really wants to see a video on that. Yeah, if you watch my video, The Antinatalist Dilemma, it goes into that.
I wish anti-nihilism were not needed. I wish suffering, the primary disease of sentience, did not need to be prevented. But it does. I am an anti-nihilist because it pains me to see suffering, especially when that suffering is preventable. It pains me to know that innocent people get thrown into an existence where, given sentience, suffering and death are 100% guaranteed. It pains me to know that if those responsible for procreation had been more thoughtful and kind and caring, they would have prevented needless and...
The horse is in the chat as well. But I'm not sure if they're making a joke or if they're a troll.
Unconsented suffering. I think anti-nihilism is the most noble ideology, not because it is the most
the nature of life is
popular or
boredom. You must get
intellectual,
used to it.
but because it is
If
the
it's
most
hunger,
necessary
I know you have
in
food
a
as well.
non-ideal world. We are brought into a truly broken world, and we can delude ourselves all we want to ignore that fact, but it still remains a fact deeply ingrained into the very physical laws of our universe. Order will always be followed by disorder, and in that lies the inevitable fact that any sentience will witness change and loss. Nothing is permanent, and therefore no joy is permanent. It's true that by the same token, no suffering is permanent, but no suffering is necessary in the first place either. If only sentience were considerate enough to not perpetuate itself into other new beings. Over the course of my career, I've met and gotten to know the stories of thousands of people. But one thing is common across the board. The reason people see doctors is to address their suffering, either because they have an active illness or because...
Yeah, being a doctor as an antinatalist must be fucking hard, because it's like, as an antinatalist, you're constantly talking about the suffering that like certain people are imposing on other people. And like when you're a doctor, you're constantly coming into contact with the suffering that you are arguing about. So it must be pretty big, pretty hard.
Because they want to avoid an illness, or at least minimize the suffering that comes with illness and aging. Some might say this makes me biased because my daily focus is more toward suffering. I would say that...
Yeah, I mean, some people call it a bias. Like, you can also just say that you're more informed, you know?
This is an intricate part of our reality. I don't...
Also, just calling someone biased is like, it's an ad hominem, so it's not actually an argument. Like, it can be a valid topic of conversation, but if you're actually arguing about well, if you're having a discussion about the arguments, then it's not really relevant.
Don't ignore the joys of life. Of course, I want to enjoy the good times. But this is because I am already existing. I don't have the choice to revert back to non-existence. It is too late for me. My fate, like everyone listening to this, is sealed. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Why am I an anti-nihilist? Because I don't want my children to suffer. And avoiding procreation is the only way to guarantee that. Someone who chooses to procreate, whether they see it or not, is dooming his or her children to suffer and die. I simply don't have the stomach to commit such a moral crime. It's not anyone's fault that these are the choices we face. Humans should be pitied for being in this predicament. As a pragmatist, though, making the best of a bad situation also reduces suffering. In addition to not procreating, the next best thing to do is to work toward reducing the suffering of those already here. We should all strive for that, whether in small or big ways, in our own lives and in the lives of others.
The germ theory is in the chat as well, saying number 2, The Contagion Myth by Thomas S. Cohen and Sally Fallon Morell. Germ theory. What? First of all, what's number 1? And second of all, what is that? Is that like is that a book recommendation you're making, or?
Wherein lies meaning. Thank you so much for listening and giving these ideas your valuable time and attention.
Cool. So that was actually a what do you call it? A submission to Amanda's contest. Cool. So it's 15. This one doesn't have a number, and then it's 17. So I'm assuming this is actually the next one. So
Yeah, so annoying.
This one will be interesting.
Yeah,
this one's an actual presentation.
Tries to flop over in the bookshelf and realize you'll fall off.
Practicing clinician, a grand round style presentation. Okay, interesting. So there's a few more things in the chat. So Heartcare. Heartborn is saying being in healthcare is indeed hellish. I've heard quite a few testimonials from new acquaintances and friends. They have to hide it, living a big lie without being able to point to the actual cause. Also, Hotcure, you know antinatalists who work in healthcare as well. And Germ Theory is putting some more books, I presume they are, in the chat. Yeah, Germ Theory. What are you putting in the chat for? Is it a are they like recommendations, or what are they relevant for?
Welcome. The following
Who
is
the
a
fuck is
presentation intended
texting
for
me?
people who work in the
I
medical
will
field, but much
bring
of what
my
I will
own
discuss
asshole.
applies to the general public.
Oh.
Grand rounds is a common type of presentation in medicine that dives into a clinically relevant topic, presents cases, and provides practical information clinicians
called
can use in their practice. I chose to put this
nothing.
presentation together
There's
because
nothing to watch,
antinatalism is a
just
topic
random
few
chance, bro.
clinicians are familiar with, even though it has the potential to do a lot of good in medicine. I have no financial conflicts of interest related to this topic or presentation. It goes without saying, though, that I am an anti-nihilist, and this means my take on the subject of this talk is biased. Of course, it would be hard to find anyone who is completely agnostic and unbiased on this issue, since most people are pro-natalists and thus would be biased in the opposite direction. Take a moment to think about it. Think back to all the patients you have witnessed suffering, all the times you have helped them alleviate the suffering, sometimes successfully, sometimes in vain.
Actually, before we go on, I'm just going to shrink myself so that you can, now that there's an actual presentation, I'm just going to shrink myself so that you guys can see the presentation, because usually it's a still image, there's not really much to see. So there you go.
As a medical student, I witnessed a cyanotic newborn die before her mom had a chance to hold him. As a resident, I held the hand of a dying woman in the ICU with an inhumane number of tubes and lines coming out of her body. As an attending, numerous patients have shared with me how miserable getting old and disabled is. For most of my career, I didn't have the mental framework to realize that these and every scenario of disease and suffering could have been prevented. The way to do this is incredibly simple, yet sadly, few people actually take it seriously. I would like you to walk away from this talk not only with a lot of food for thought, but also with some tools to do something concrete with this new information. I'll go over the term antinatalism, show how it is medically relevant, most critically in the prevention of suffering, and how to implement these principles in clinical practice, and ideally everyday life in an ethical manner. Let's start with the term antinatalism. Although the concept has been around for millennia, there's no...
And Juan is in the chat from Milwaukee. Nice to see you in the chat, Juan.
universally agreed upon
fellow
definition,
Wisconsinite.
largely
Hey,
because the term didn't get coined until
hell,
relatively
on earth.
recently. I would define it as a philosophy claiming it is unethical to bring sentient life into existence due to the inherent suffering and eventual death imposed on that being, especially considering such an imposition.
This is an interesting one, Heartborn. If you do know antinatalists who work in healthcare, then you could send them this presentation.
Occurs without the being's consent. It is important to know this definition presupposes two very important things. One, that suffering and death are harms worth preventing. Thus, imposing them is unethical. Two, that imposing a harm on someone without their consent is undesirable. Obviously, a being cannot give consent before coming into existence. Therefore, this harm is always imposed without consent. In contrast, pronatalism, or more commonly natalism, claims it is ethical and desirable to bring sentient life into existence. As you might imagine, this philosophy has massive implications. So I want to spend some time here recognizing that antinatalism can be very hard to internalize. It challenges societal norms, cultural beliefs, and perhaps even what one considers the meaning of life. There are some hard truths we need to contend with. First, sentient life itself has inherent harms. Second, once brought into existence, a sentient person will suffer and eventually die. Third, ethically, those responsible for that person's conception are responsible for his or her suffering. Now, by this, I mean they are undeniably responsible for the person being put in harm's way in the first place,
not necessarily that they imposed all specific harms themselves. We could spend hours dissecting all these points and unfolding their implications, but my point here is to lay out the basic premises to highlight that.
You know, a lot of I've heard some people say two things simultaneously, which seem to suggest cognitive dissonance. So I've heard some people say, on the one hand, they don't agree that someone is responsible for the suffering of the person they create. You know, like he's saying here, you know, ethically, those responsible for that person's conception are responsible for his or her suffering. So I've heard people disagree with that, right? Because I agree with that, but I've heard people disagree with that. But then they also say, when it comes to politics, if you voted for X party, you are responsible for the suffering they have caused. Right. So typically it tends to be left-wing people who say that about conservatives, but I'm sure it's happened the other way around as well. So
humans are trash.
That to me seems like a bit of cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand you're saying you took this action voting for a party, right?
Eliminate
and whilst you didn't inflict the specific individual sufferings of that the party caused once they're in power, you voted for that party, and you know, for the purposes of the argument, you got them into power, right? So you put that initial set of conditions in place, and that resulted to specific harms happening. So they blame people for that, but then when someone brings up this, they say, "Oh, I can't be held to account for all of the individual sufferings that this person is going through. I didn't know that those specific sufferings were going to happen when I created them." And it's like, well, no, you may not be the direct perpetrator of all of those specific sufferings and harms, but you did put in place the initial set of conditions that caused them all to happen, like when someone votes for a political party. And actually, when someone votes for a political party, it's less clear. You vote for a political party, you know, they may not, you may be voting for them because of their manifesto. You know, they may go off their manifesto, they may do things that, you know, you weren't expecting, all this sort of stuff. But when you create someone, you directly, and also when you vote for a party, you're only one vote in millions and millions of votes. But when it comes to procreation, you're that person who creates. Okay, well, there's two of you, so you get half the responsibility each. And like, you can have a pretty good idea of all of the different harms that are gonna face them in life, or could potentially face them in life. So I kind of see these as analogous. There may be some specific differences between voting for a political party and creating someone, but like, I've heard the same person say these two things. I disagree with that, but agree with the other one. And I just always thought, like, do you not see like how you're contradicting yourself there? I don't know what you guys think, if that is like a decent analogy, but yeah. So Harpborn says,
well, this is an analogy.
Fucking to all future generations that spawn from us. Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. One says, I wish most people would admit it after doing some rational thinking, but they choose illusions over facts. Yeah. And Harborn says, let's say somewhat responsible, which still is a type of responsibility. Yeah. So you
the difference is that I think that the suffering is inherently valuable in a negative way, and Anton thinks that it's just a subjective thing. That's just like, oh, you know, I think it's bad. The guy next door may not, and if he doesn't, then, you know, I guess he's just as right as I am. So
I think when it comes to voting for a political party, I would use a term like somewhat responsible. But when it comes to creating someone, like, I don't feel like I can really water it down, because it's like when you had complete control. So like when it comes to voting for a political party, yeah, you may have voted for them, but like all of that stuff may have happened anyway. Like even if you abstained from voting, they could have got past the mark that they needed to be able to get into power. But so it may have been out of your hands anyway. Like, so you're like somewhat responsible, you know, if you actively participated in it. But with procreation, it's like, it ain't happening unless you take an active part in it. So it's like the chain of events, if you take any specific suffering, like the chain of events all come back to you. You're the fundamental cause of them. So I would find it hard to water it down to somewhat responsible. I do think with voting that's accurate, but when it comes to this, like, I'm more inclined to use a stronger form. Cool. Okay, I was just seeing if there's anything else in the chat.
If we admit these things are true, we have some work to do as medical professionals who care about people. Despite antinatalism being logically consistent, medical professionals are just as susceptible as anyone else to reject the philosophy based on previously held beliefs.
But it's interesting. So with healthcare, there are quite unique interactions with antinatalism and healthcare, because in healthcare, it may depend on the country and the system, but they put like a lot of emphasis on consent, right? It's hard for me to give specific examples because I'm actually not a healthcare professional, obviously, but like I presume in medical ethics there's a specific interpretation of what consent means and where it's applicable and where it's not. And so medical professionals could actually have a specific interpretation of the consent argument that the layperson wouldn't have. But yeah.
But if we really mean it when we say we want to reduce suffering in an ethical way, we can't ignore anti-nihilism being a way to do this. Preventing or minimizing harm is one of the top priorities in medicine. Whenever we give a medical recommendation or administer a treatment, reducing harm as much as possible should be one of our most important guiding principles. Our job as medical professionals is to help reduce and prevent suffering. Much of our energy is spent in attempting to delay death, presumably in most cases for those who want that death delayed. Although the actual indefinite prevention of death is not seen as realistic for currently living people, death can indeed be prevented simply by preventing conception in the first place. I will discuss consent and patient autonomy in more depth later, but few would argue against the importance of patients being able to understand and give permission to any intervention that affects their bodies. Consent is central to ethical anti-nihilism. So, medicine and anti-nihilism have very similar goals. Most of us went into the medical field to help reduce suffering. If we, as medical professionals...
Oh, sorry, I wasn't, didn't pause.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
do a
interesting.
shitty job at it, given that most
he's
things
highlighting the
are
common roots of the two things.
live.
So maybe his goal is here, and,
Whether
and
will or
maybe I'm
not.
like late here. Maybe everyone else has realized this, but like maybe he's just trying to show that antinatalism is a logical conclusion from the starting point that medical ethics takes. And so he's trying to show that if we are to take medical ethics seriously, antinatalism should be a norm in the medical workplace or the medical setting. Yeah, interesting.
Are serious about reducing suffering, we should also be serious about ethically preventing it altogether. As you have already figured out, the prevention I'm talking about does not apply to current people.
And hey, Yana's in the chat. And Yana says, I'm not sure if medicine ultimately aims to reduce suffering or keep alive at all costs, like keep people living at all costs. Well, so a lot of, so there will be different classifications. So some medicine will be preventing harm. Some medicine will be alleviating harm. And both of those two things can be done while someone is alive and maintaining their life. But also, when it comes to euthanasia, that can be done for purposes of preventing and alleviating harm being done to someone. So I wouldn't say that medicine ultimately aims to keep people alive, because there are circumstances, it depends on the country, obviously, and the system, but there are circumstances where euthanasia is an option for people. So I wouldn't say ultimately medicine aims to keep people alive. Well, it depends. If you mean medicine as in like actual physical medicine, or you just mean the institution of medicine in general, depends what you mean. And Exploring Antinatalism podcast is in the chat. Hey, Amanda. Antinatalism takes essentially the same pledge that doctors do, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah, Harp1 says something of an informal oath. What does AFAIK mean? Am I getting this wrong? Is that like similar to AFK, away from keyboard? I'm not sure what you mean. Oh, as far as I know, right? Okay, yeah, I'm just being an idiot.
In the sense that we'll be able to prevent death and suffering for them.
And Hobo's saying medicine was also used not too long ago for heinous purposes. Very true. You know, even things that are established and invented to help people can be used for bad purposes, and the other way around. There can be things that are made to hurt people that can, in some cases, be used to benefit people as well. But it's a valid point, Hobo.
Rather, this prevention applies to potential future people. I would argue contraception is one of the most
Ro is in the chat as well.
Valuable human inventions. Avoiding conception is the only guaranteed way to prevent suffering and death. As clinicians, we should use this tool to its full ethical extent. I won't go into the specifics of counseling patients through all the possible contraception methods, but I wanted to point out the variety of options we have.
It won't just be you guys. I actually can't read this either. But it is. Let me just have a look. So it is various methods of birth control, and I think it's just talking about the pros and cons of different types. I think.
At the top of this table are the most effective methods, not including abstinence. The risk of pregnancy noted here in the first column refers to the number of women out of every 100 who have an unintended pregnancy within the first year of typical use of each method. The term typical use is distinguished from perfect use and refers to the failure rate in the hands of an average user that may not always follow the instructions of use perfectly.
Just get a vasectomy.
Therefore, this quoted rate of failure is higher than that for perfect use,
Get a
which assumes perfect
vasectomy.
adherence to instructions, but still has risk of failure due to the margin of error inherent in the mechanism of the contraceptive method. The table here lists methods approved by the FDA in the US as of this recording. There are a few other male contraception options in development, but those are not yet widely available.
Yeah, there's two that I know of. There's one which is the male pill, which is being developed, and the other one is called vasogel, which is basically like a temporary vasectomy. So obviously, with a vasectomy, there's the vas deferens tubes, which they cut and remove a section. But the vasogel would be injected into the tube and basically form it would be like a block, a barrier, like a wall, so that the sperm can't get out. So you, for all intents and purposes, at that point have a vasectomy, but it's easily reversible. So they can go back in and inject something that causes it to dissolve. So it's like a temporary vasectomy.
Speaking of which, as you may
But as far as I'm aware, neither of those things are actually on the market yet. They're both still in development and testing.
notice, most of the methods listed here are for women. But this, of course, is not a reflection of whose decision matters more. Sorry to state the obvious, but a lot of people seem to forget basic biology. I find it frustrating when contraception counseling focuses on women as if they were the only ones responsible. Even some electronic medical record systems are set up such that it is assumed that contraception is only a women's health issue. Contraception counseling should be part of every patient's regular care if they are biologically capable of reproducing. Normalizing this is step one. Without patient autonomy, we lose all sense of ethics in medicine. And as with any medical intervention, consent is key. Our job in the clinical setting is not to proselytize, but rather to inform and present options that make both medical and ethical sense based on our expertise.
So Ro in the chat is saying it's mainly a women's health issue, though women have a lot more to lose. So that is true. When it comes to the risks and the the burden and stuff like that of like the potential risks of sex and stuff are and potential consequences are more for women. They're higher for women, but that doesn't mean that like men should not take any responsibility. Obviously, men and women are both equally responsible for ensuring conception doesn't occur.
Amen.
But it is the case that if conception does occur, then obviously like the vast majority of the burden then or the outcome then falls on the woman. But yeah.
Expertise and knowledge. We should stay as far away as possible from coercion. Let's remember that contraception counseling is standard of care. We are not talking about earth-shaking or unorthodox practices here. We are simply making sure we don't forget to do one of the most important parts of our job. Because there are so many pregnancies